They say grief comes in waves, but that morning the lake was still. It was the kind of stillness you do not notice until it is broken. Not by thunder, not by bird song, but by something colder, paper, plastic, the low crunch of shoes on gravel. I had just finished casting my line, the weight of the lure pulling a smooth arc through the dawn air before kissing the water. That kiss had not even rippled twice before I heard it. The clearing of a throat that was not mine. I turned. Pamela Crane was standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, smile too tight to be real. She was wearing that pastel blouse again, the one that made her look like a retired ice skater, frozen in time and judgment. Behind her, taped to my porch railing in fluorescent orange, was a notice flapping slightly in the breeze. My name was not printed on it, but the word violation was. She waited, silent, pleased with herself. I reeled in my line, slow and even, as if not to startle the paper. I climbed the steps without saying a word and tore the notice free. It made a sound like dead leaves. Unauthorized use of HOA governed water access. Fine. $500. Violation. Code. 7.2. I stood there, wet boots dripping onto the welcome mat Claire had picked out 3 years ago. The mat had once read, "Quiet, please, the lake is listening." But some of the letters had worn away, so now it just read, "Quite the lake is inning." It felt like a message no one understood anymore, not even me. Pamela shifted her weight from one orthopedic sneaker to the other. "You were seen casting a fishing line into common water without HOA approval," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "This lake is considered shared recreational space, and access is subject to compliance." She said compliance the way some people say salvation, like it saved her from something. I looked past her, out toward the water. The mist was still clinging to the surface like it had not gotten the memo. A blue heron stood frozen near the reeds, still as stone. No other houses stirred. The rest of the neighborhood was asleep, tucked into bed under the illusion that nothing here ever changes. "Pamela," I said slowly, "this dock sits behind my property line." Always has she blinked, but only once. "The HOA has jurisdiction over the lake as a whole," she replied, "regardless of property lines. It is in the bylaws. I wanted to ask her if she had ever read those bylaws. Not skimmed them, not just underlined the parts that made her feel powerful, but read them, back to front. Understood them like someone who had actually paid attention during community zoning hearings instead of playing HOA dress-up. But I said nothing, because silence is what they never expect. Instead, I looked down at the notice again. The ink was starting to smudge from the moisture on my fingers. $500 for fishing. Not hunting, not dumping trash, not polluting, not even making noise. Just fishing. It had been 10 months since I had last stood on that dock. 10 months since Claire passed. 10 months of avoiding every place that still echoed with her laugh. The dock had been hers more than mine. She used to say that still water was the only honest thing left in the world. It never lied. It never tried to be more than it was. And she had loved it. I had stayed away because I could not bear how honest it felt without her. But that morning, something had changed. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the sun rose without apology. Maybe I had simply run out of excuses. I made a cup of coffee, carried my old rod down to the dock, and tried to remember how it felt to cast a line into something that did not expect anything back. And that was when they came for me. Pamela cleared her throat again. "The fine is due within 15 business days. Failure to comply may result in further disciplinary action, including loss of common privileges." I almost laughed. Common privileges. As if grief ever honored boundaries. As if silence belonged to a board of volunteers with laminated badges. I folded the notice, slow and sharp, one crease at a time. Then I looked Pamela in the eye. Really looked at her. She blinked again, this time faster. "Thank you," I said. Not because I meant it, but because she would never understand what I was thanking her for. Pamela nodded and turned, walking back down the path like she had just saved the neighborhood from a potential uprising, like she had defended order. The door closed behind me. I sat down at the kitchen table, the ticket still damp in my palm. Across from me, the chair Claire once filled remained empty, but her eyes were still everywhere. In the mug I had used for years, in the framed photo by the sink, in the old fishing vest, still hanging behind the back door. The vest had one pocket she had sewn shut. I had always meant to ask why. Now I would never know. I unfolded the notice once more and laid it flat on the table. I studied the signature, not typed, inked, her actual handwriting, her actual authority, looping like barbed wire. I had only just cast my line after 10 months of grief, and that was when they decided to drown me in paperwork. I was not always this quiet. There was a time when I used to speak in numbers, in fluid dynamics and pressure values. I used to calculate the resistance of river walls and the velocity of runoff beneath concrete bridges. I built things that no one ever saw, things buried beneath the surface, things that only mattered when everything else went wrong. I spent 34 years as a hydraulic engineer, but retirement makes silence louder. When Claire passed, I thought the silence would kill me, but it just waited, patient, like the lake outside. At first, I filled the void with the usual distractions. Projects that did not matter, frozen meals that tasted like wet cardboard, old Clint Eastwood movies played too loud to be company. Then, one afternoon, I found myself tracing the property line behind our home, the one that curved down past the rose bushes Claire had planted, down to the edge of the water where the dock met the lake. I stood there a long time, longer than I meant to, long enough to feel her in the air. That was the day I decided to stop running from the quiet. I stopped trying to drown it out. I let it in. I moved here for the stillness. I had bought the house not long after Claire's diagnosis. The city was too loud, too fast, too full of unnecessary movement. We wanted somewhere that did not require pretending, somewhere that did not echo with the sound of clocks ticking down. This house, with its sagging porch and cracked flagstones, had a dock that looked like it had not been used in decades. That was what sold me. We spent 2 years here together before she passed. 2 years of morning coffee on that dock. 2 years of silence that was shared instead of feared. When she was gone, I stayed because I could not bring myself to start over again. I stayed because here, at least, the grief had walls, boundaries, fences I could mend, grass I could mow, a lake I could look at without blinking. And then came Pamela Crane. To be fair, she was not always the monster people now call her. When I first moved in, she brought over a pie, cherry, with a lattice crust that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. She smiled the way politicians do, wide and staged. I thanked her, and she thanked me for choosing such a peaceful community. She never asked what I did for a living. She never asked about Claire, but she always asked if I had read the HOA guidebook. Every time we crossed paths, every single time. I did read it, eventually. It was 22 pages long, full of vague language and confident italics. Most of it was a common sense dressed in bureaucracy, noise curfews, garbage can placement, lawn maintenance. But tucked between the lines were phrases like collective easement enforcement and community-controlled recreational zones. The lake was one of them. No one had ever explained how an entire body of water, one that ran through several private properties, could be community-controlled. But no one had ever questioned it either, not until now. I suppose, in Pamela's mind, people like me are not meant to question things. People who live alone, people who do not show up to HOA meetings, people who say good morning and nothing else. She probably thought I would pay the fine, shrink into my walls, and disappear behind the hedges like a guilty shadow. She did not know that I used to help counties write zoning maps. She did not know that I had stood in courtrooms as an expert witness when land disputes turned ugly. She did not know that I had spent decades explaining water rights to men twice my size, who did not understand that rivers cannot be owned, only managed. But I did not tell her any of that, because silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the space you need to think clearly. Sometimes it is a warning. After the fine, I did not call her. I did not fight it. Not yet. I simply sat at my kitchen table and opened the drawer Claire used to keep our mortgage paperwork in. It smelled like lavender and dust. Her handwriting was still on the tab dividers. Inside, I found everything: the deed, the tax statements, the surveyor's map from the day we closed on the property. And there it was. Plain as day. A black line that ran around the perimeter of the lake behind our house, carving out a thin wedge of shoreline marked private use, non-transferable riparian access. That was where the confusion began. Or maybe where it ended. I made copies, scanned every page, saved them to a folder on my computer labeled Quiet War. Then I went back outside, stood on the dock, and cast my line again. The air was cooler that day, crisper, and I could swear the lake was listening. They underestimated me. They saw a quiet old man living alone. They saw flannel shirts and muddy boots. They saw someone who never raised his voice or filed a complaint. They saw someone who stood still while they moved in circles of petty control and laminated rules. But they forgot the first law of water. Still things are not always shallow. Still things run deep. I am not a fighter by nature. I do not enjoy conflict, but I know how to hold my ground, especially when that ground sits next to a body of water that I have every legal right to access. Pamela Crane made a mistake. She picked the wrong man to fine. She picked the wrong lake to claim. And she picked the worst possible time to test the patience of someone who had already lost everything, except his silence. Have you ever been underestimated just because you chose silence? They came for me just after sunrise, not with sirens or shouting. That would have required courage. No, they arrived with clipboards and plastic smiles, quiet footsteps on dew-covered grass, the kind of invasion that calls itself order. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I saw the reflection first, a sliver of movement in the lake's surface. At first I thought it was a bird skimming low. Then I caught the glint of gold from a name tag. 4 of them were standing at the edge of my dock like they had rehearsed their positions, and leading the charge. Pamela Crane, arms folded, lips pressed so tightly together they looked stapled shut. I stepped outside with the mug still in my hand. "Good morning," I said, though I did not mean it. Pamela did not respond. She just waved her clipboard in the air like a preacher holding a holy book upside down. "This is an official inspection," she said, loud enough for the Harpers across the street to hear. Their blinds twitched like nervous eyelids. "Following last week's violation, the HOA has received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized activity on community-managed water complaints," I repeated. "From whom?" She smiled with her teeth, but not her eyes. "That information is protected." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. It was the same tactic I used when clients tried to rush through engineering bids without understanding the blueprints. Let the silence make them feel uncertain. Pamela hated silence. That much I already knew. She gestured toward my dock. "You have continued to access the lake in direct violation of the citation issued on Friday. This constitutes willful non-compliance." "Pamela," I said calmly, "my property extends 10 feet into that shoreline. It is in the deed." She laughed once, a short, sharp exhale that sounded like a pencil snapping. "Deeds do not override community bylaws," she said. "This lake is HOA regulated. That dock was not permitted. Your fishing activity is considered trespass against common resources." I looked down at the boards beneath my feet. Claire and I had sanded them ourselves. She had insisted on a deeper varnish to match the amber tone of the lake at sunset. I had not changed a single plank since she passed. "Then, perhaps," I said slowly, "you should have cited the lake itself. Because I have not moved my dock. The lake has simply remained where it has always been." That got a few sideways glances from the others. One of the board members, a younger man with hair too gelled for a Saturday morning, looked unsure, but Pamela doubled down. "You are hereby summoned to a compliance hearing," she said, pulling a folded sheet from her clipboard and holding it out toward me like a sword. "Tuesday evening, Community Center. 7 o'clock sharp." Before I could take the paper, she dropped it on my doormat. Then came the real moment, the one she had choreographed from the beginning. She turned back toward the street, raised her voice, and called out, "Deputy Ray?" I heard the familiar crunch of boots behind her. A flash of brown uniform appeared from the side yard. Deputy Raymond Keller had been with the county sheriff's office longer than any of the HOA board members had lived in the neighborhood. He was the kind of man who always looked like he had just come from breakfast, polite, unhurried, and half apologetic about everything. "Morning, Dan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Pamela here asked for a little presence." "Presence?" I said. "Not intervention?" He hesitated. "Just here to keep the peace." She filed a formal complaint about potential non-compliance and wanted an officer to witness. Pamela stood straighter. I believed there might be a confrontation. I raised an eyebrow. Because I drink coffee on my porch? She ignored that. Deputy, I am asking you to record Mr. Whitaker's continued violation of Section the 7.2. Ray shifted uncomfortably. Pamela, you know I cannot enforce HOA regulations. That is a civil matter. I want it on record. He looked at me and gave a small shrug, embarrassed, powerless. I will file a note that I was present, he said, and that there was no disturbance. Pamela did not like that answer. Her face tightened, jaw clenched like she was holding in a scream, but she nodded stiffly. Very well, she said. You will hear from us Tuesday, Mr. Whitaker. They turned in unison, a pack of self-appointed enforcers, marching back toward the sidewalk like they had just protected the nation from a domestic threat. Pamela lingered a moment longer, eyes scanning the lake as if searching for a loophole. Enjoy your weekend, she said without warmth. Then she left. I waited until I could no longer hear their footsteps before stepping down to the dock. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. I knelt and touched the edge of the water with my fingers. Not to test it, but to remind myself it was real. The lake did not care who claimed it. It reflected who stood near it, but it belonged to no one. It had existed long before bylaws and laminated name tags, before fences and fines and folding chairs arranged in committee rows. I sat down on the last plank and looked across the water. I could see the rooftops of the other houses, each one a copy of the last, neat little boxes stacked with rules. HOA pamphlets tucked behind storm doors, lawn signs about pets and politics, smiles that stretched only as far as property lines. They had made a mistake. Pamela thought that by embarrassing me in front of my neighbors, I would fold. She thought a clipboard and a citation would scare me off the dock. But some of us are made of quieter things, and quiet things. When pressured, do not shatter. They settle, and then they rise. The paper was older than I remembered. I had stored it in a brown accordion file Claire labeled just in case. It lived at the back of the hallway closet behind winter gloves, a box of Christmas ornaments, and a stack of expired voter guides. When I finally opened it, the smell of dry ink and time hit me like memory itself. Not musty, not rotten, just still. That morning, after Pamela's little performance with her board members and Deputy Ray, I did not rage. I did not draft angry emails or prepare shouting matches for Tuesday's meeting. Instead, I made a pot of strong black coffee, cleared the kitchen table, and laid everything out in rows. Like an autopsy of ownership. Deed, surveyor's map, tax assessments. A zoning map from the county dated back to the year the neighborhood was built. Most people never look at these things after closing. They trust that title companies and real estate agents have dotted the I's and crossed the T's. But I used to live in the world of lines and borders. As an engineer, I spent decades studying what was buried beneath what people thought they owned. Culverts that crossed lots, forgotten storm drains, seasonal creeks that reappeared after every rainfall. It was my job to explain to people, gently, that just because you planted flowers near something did not mean you owned it. Pamela Crane did not strike me as someone who had ever questioned a line she did not draw herself. So, I began to read, slowly, methodically. It was not just about proving her wrong. It was about reminding myself that silence could still be an act of defiance. The deed was standard, but the boundary map attached to it had a small, handwritten annotation in faded blue ink. Right along the edge of the lake, in small cursive, someone had written, "Riparian rights retained, lot 11 through 14. I traced the words with my finger, once, then again. Riparian. It was not a word you heard often unless you had spent time in water law or environmental planning. It referred to a specific type of property right, one that pertained to access, usage, and control of natural water sources that bordered private land. If the lake behind my house was a naturally occurring body of water, and all evidence suggested it was, then riparian rights could override the HOA's blanket claim of control, especially if it was stated in writing during the subdivision of the land. I needed confirmation. I scanned the document, saved it as a PDF, and sent it to someone I had not spoken to in almost 6 years. Carla Nguyen, a former colleague from a zoning commission project out in Arizona. She had become a land rights attorney after leaving the engineering field, and the last I heard, she specialized in municipal boundary disputes. I kept my message short. Need clarification on riparian clause. Attached map. Can I still claim rights? Not urgent, but real. While I waited, I stared at the map again. My eyes drifted to the edge of the dock drawn in pencil. It was smaller than the one I built. Back then, the shoreline had been more overgrown. Claire wanted to leave the wild reeds, but I had cleared them after her passing, trying to keep the snakes away. That thought brought me to the photo album, the one we never labeled. I flipped through it until I found the picture I was looking for. Claire, barefoot on the dock, holding a thermos in one hand and my hand in the other, her hair tied up, her cheeks wind-kissed. She had been sick even then, but she smiled like the wind belonged to her. I remembered what she said that morning. Her voice was soft but deliberate. Keep this place safe. It is the only quiet we have left. At the time, I thought she meant the house. Now I realized she meant the water. That afternoon, Carla called. I could hear her kids in the background, yelling about who took the last apple slice, but her voice cut clean through the chaos. You are not crazy, she said without preamble. If that note was added to the official plat and not just a draft, then yes. You still have riparian access rights. And if the HOA never recorded a formal easement agreement overriding those rights, they do not own. Exclusive use of the lake, I exhaled slowly. But, she added, you will need to get your hands on the original master development plan and see how the lake was designated when the HOA was formed. If they claimed it under common area without legal authority to do so, you have a case. A strong one. I thanked her and hung up. The air felt different in the kitchen, like the room had just taken a deep breath with me. I went outside and sat on the dock, not to fish, not to reclaim space, just to listen. The water was calm again, not still like surrender, but still like poise. The kind of calm that waits, the kind that calculates. Pamela had come at me with fines and bylaws and public humiliation. But I had something she would never understand. I had time. She wanted a fight. What she would get instead was something far more unsettling. Quiet preparation. No protests. No raised voice. Just well-organized documents, legal precedents, and a silence so sharp it could cut through every paper she taped to a mailbox. People like Pamela mistake calmness for consent. They mistake politeness for weakness. And they always forget that the people who say the least are usually the ones who know the most. I ran my fingers along the edge of the dock and let the echo of Claire's voice settle deep inside me. She was right. This place, this lake, this home, this stillness. It was the only quiet I had left, and I was going to protect it. Do you believe silence can be the strongest response? I did not bring my fishing rod that morning. Instead, I brought a manila envelope, 3 photocopies, and a hammer. The sun had not yet broken over the tree line when I knelt at the edge of the dock. The boards creaked beneath me, familiar now, like old bones adjusting with each move. I brushed away a few pine needles that had drifted down overnight, then carefully positioned the wooden post I had pre-cut in the garage. It was no bigger than a mailbox, just enough height to be noticed, but not enough to scream. The sign read, "Privately claimed shoreline, title review in progress." No accusations, no threats, just the truth. Printed in black lettering, laminated against morning fog. I stood there a while, watching the reflection of the sign shimmer against the surface of the lake. The water lapped gently against the shoreline, unconcerned with politics. If Pamela Crane wanted a war, she would have to fight something far more dangerous than anger. Precision. The first letter went out that afternoon. I sent it by certified mail and email, addressed to Pamela and each board member individually. No caps lock, no dramatics. Just language that made people sit up straighter in their chairs. Subject: Request for documentation, community governance over lake use. Dear Mrs. Crane, I am writing to formally request documentation proving legal ownership or governance authority granted to the HOA over the lake bordering Lot 12, as referenced in violation. 7.2 issued against me on the 12th of this month. As a resident and property holder with recorded riparian annotations on the original lot plat, I am exercising my right to verify the legal basis of the fine issued and the jurisdiction claimed by the HOA over said body of water. Please provide, at your earliest convenience, the original transfer deed placing the lake under HOA control, the easement agreement, if any, signed by all riparian lot owners, the master development plan outlining common use, zoning for the lake, any covenants or restrictions legally recorded with the county clerk. Pending receipt of this documentation, I will consider the fine unenforceable and the claim of HOA jurisdiction under dispute. Sincerely, Daniel Whitaker Lot, 12 Lakeside, HOA. I did not expect a response the same day. But I sent a second letter anyway, this one to the county land office. It was less dramatic, more procedural. I requested a full title history of the lake and surrounding parcels, including any public or private access designations. I included the scanned plat with the riparian rights retained note and asked if there had been any filings that nullified it. 2 letters, that was all. Not protests, not meetings. Just 2 precise steps on a chessboard most people had forgotten was even there. That evening, I took my coffee out to the dock. The sign was still standing. No one had tampered with it. But I noticed something different. Pamela's car driving by, slower than usual. She did not stop. She did not get out. But she stared hard at that sign, as if it spoke a language she could not read. And maybe it did, because what Pamela feared more than conflict was uncertainty. She ruled by rhythm, citations, warnings, hearings, a bureaucracy of intimidation that relied on people staying confused and compliant. She expected panic, argument, drama. What she got instead was documentation. The next day, a board member knocked on my door. Not Pamela, a man named Greg with soft eyes and a handshake too practiced to be natural. "Just here to clarify," he said, shifting on his feet. "We are not trying to create hostility. This is just a misunderstanding. Perhaps you could take down the sign until the meeting?" I invited him in for coffee, not because I wanted to, but because I knew how unnerving it was for people like Greg when you stayed polite. We sat in the sunroom. I handed him a copy of the deed and the annotated map. "Greg," I said, "you and I both know that governing a lake without recorded authority is like trying to tax the wind." He gave a weak smile. "Pamela just wants consistency." "So do I replied. "That is why I want it in writing." He left after 15 minutes, holding the documents like they were hot. I knew what would happen next. The board would panic. Not because I was loud, but because I was prepared. They would scramble through their records, try to piece together. Retroactive logic, whisper about precedent. But you cannot fabricate ownership, not when the water remembers. 2 days later, I received a formal reply from Pamela. Short, dismissive. Subject, RE, request for documentation. Denied. Mr. Whitaker, the HOA is not obligated to provide internal governance materials to individual residents. Your compliance hearing remains scheduled for Tuesday evening. We expect your attendance and cooperation. Sincerely, Pamela Crane. HOA, President, no attachments, no documents, no proof. I printed it out and filed it under a new label. Refusal to disclose. Let the record show. I asked. Tuesday came. I did not go. Instead, I filed a request with the county mediation office, citing a jurisdictional dispute between HOA claims and private riparian rights. That triggered a 30-day review period, during which no enforcement action could proceed. Pamela must have received the notice by now. She had gone from waving papers to watching windows. I saw her one morning on her porch, phone in hand, but no words coming out. People assume power is loud, but real power, the kind that makes people nervous, is often quiet. It shows up in signatures and sealed envelopes, in maps pulled from forgotten drawers, in the silence of someone who has nothing left to lose but refuses to be erased. I did not raise my voice. I raised a question, and now the weight of answering it rested on them. The problem with lines on paper is that people think they are permanent. They believe that a black stroke on a map has more weight than the land itself, that because a boundary is drawn with ink, It somehow holds more truth than a tree that has stood for 100 years. But maps are only honest if the people holding the pen know what they are doing. Pamela Crane had never held such a pen. I had. I spent nearly 3 decades translating dirt and water into legal terms. Municipal engineers like me do not get monuments. We get footnotes in zoning files and initials on blueprints. But if you dig into the ground deep enough or stare at the water long enough, you will find our fingerprints. And I was ready to find mine. The county title office responded faster than expected. The clerk, a soft-voiced man named Elijah, called me directly. He had a background in civil planning and said my inquiry was refreshingly specific. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "you were right to ask. The lake was never formally deeded to the HO. AI leaned against the doorframe, phone pressed tight. What does that mean exactly? It means the developer left the lake classified as natural riparian space. It was never designated as a common area in the original HOA charter. No transfer documents, no easements recorded. It is not theirs to govern." I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. Elijah continued. "That annotation you sent, the riparian rights note, it is valid. The original engineer who signed that plat was, let me see, Daniel Whitaker. That caught me off guard. I had not looked at the engineer's name on the original map. It had been a long time since I reviewed my own projects. But there it was, my own past staring back at me like a perfectly measured arc. "I guess I knew what I was doing," I said. He laughed. "Looks like you built yourself a good defense, 30 years before anyone tried to take it away." I thanked him and hung up. It felt like the lake itself had exhaled with me. Pamela did not know yet. She was still spinning in the same orbit, unaware the ground had shifted under her. But the tremors would reach her soon enough. I'd decided not to tell her directly. That was never the point. My goal was not to humiliate her. Not yet. It was to pull the rug out slowly, to let her lose balance in front of the very people she once commanded like pawns. The HOA sent out an email blast the next morning. Emergency meeting, community discussion on lake policy. Tuesday 7 p.m., Community Hall. All residents strongly encouraged to attend. I attended, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I wanted to listen. The community hall was a beige, echoing box with folding chairs and flickering fluorescent lights. Pamela stood at the front, lips pressed thin, gripping a stack of printed bylaws like a hymn book. She had never looked more like a figurehead, desperately clinging to the weight of her own podium. Jim and Melody Harper sat near the back. So did at least 24 others, neighbors I had seen only in passing, walking dogs, mowing lawns, peeking behind curtains. Pamela began with a PowerPoint. The first slide, preserving our shared resources. The second, enforcing consistency in HOA-regulated zones. She pointed at the image of the lake behind my house, now labeled with bright red lines and the word restricted access stamped across it like a warning sign. She spoke for 7 minutes straight. Not once did she mention my name. Instead, she referred to me as a homeowner currently in dispute and a situation under review. She warned of setting a dangerous precedent. She insisted the lake was meant for the community. She called for a reaffirmation vote, a procedural show of support. Then she opened the floor. That was when it happened. A man in his early 40s, wearing a flannel shirt and worn boots, stood up. I had seen him once before, walking a golden retriever. His voice was calm. His question was not, "Have you actually read the original development file?" Pamela blinked. "I am sorry?" "The original zoning documents," he clarified, "the ones that define the lake as riparian land. Because I requested a copy this week, and it does not look anything like what you are showing." The room went still. Pamela fumbled with her papers. "The HOA has always," but always, he interrupted gently, "does not mean legally. My wife and I looked at our deed last night. Our lot also backs the lake. There is a line in there about non-transferable shoreline rights." Another hand went up, then another. "I have that too," someone said. "I thought it was just old language," said another. "But now I'm not sure." Pamela's face tightened. She stammered something about historical oversight, about reinterpretation of governance models. But it was already unraveling. She had built her authority on assumption. Now the truth, like water, was seeping through every weak spot in her structure. I said nothing. I did not need to. I just sat there in the third row, legs crossed, folder on my lap. If anyone looked closely, they would see the seal of the county land office on the top page. Pamela ended the meeting early. No vote was taken. No resolution passed. Outside, the air was crisp with that early fall scent. Somewhere between mulch and memory, I walked slowly back to my truck. As I reached for the door, someone called out, "Hey, Mr. Whitaker." I turned. It was Jim Harper. "That was something in there." I smiled. "Did not have to be." He nodded. "Pamela's going to push back. You know that, right?" "I am counting on it," I said. "Because when you build a dam, you do not do it to stop the river. You do it to guide it, to slow it, to reveal its shape." She was still flooding the valley with rules, but I had the blueprint, and now everyone else could see it too. Power does not always shift in a courtroom. Sometimes it shifts in silence. In a closed office with a firm handshake and a notarized line at the bottom of a page no one else thought to read. That was how I changed the current. It started with a name, tucked into the original subdivision filing, buried below zoning permits and utility maps. Was the name of the original developer Franklin D. Lawton. I remembered it from when I first bought the house. At the time, he was just a signature. The man who had subdivided farmland and carved out a lakeside community with promises of peace, privacy, and rising property values. Most developers disappear after they build, but some still leave footprints. It took 2 weeks and 5 phone calls to track him down, not through real estate channels, through tax records. Franklin Lawton was retired now, living in a smaller town 2 counties over. According to the local tax assessor's database, he still held non-possessory ownership of 2 undeveloped parcels bordering the lake, and, more importantly, of the narrow access road leading into the water from the south end of the neighborhood. The road no one paid attention to because it had been overgrown for years, the one that did not appear on the HOA's landscaping budget. I drove out on a Friday morning, envelope in hand. Lawton answered his door, wearing a flannel shirt and a pair of worn leather slippers. His handshake was steady, but his eyes looked like they had not trusted anyone in a long time. "I heard you were coming," he said. "I hope that is a good thing." He motioned for me to come in. His living room smelled like pipe smoke and lemon oil. A long row of dusty blueprints lined the top of a bookshelf. I recognized the layout of our neighborhood instantly. The lake, the looping roads, the precise spacing of every cul-de-sac. "I thought the HOA took everything," I said. He shook his head. "They assumed they did." We sat down, and I explained what had happened. The citation, the meetings, the sign. He listened, nodding occasionally, not interrupting. When I finished, he stood, crossed the room, and pulled a manila folder from a steel file cabinet that looked older than I was. "They were supposed to submit a claim to transfer shared amenities," he said. "They never did. Just started acting like it was theirs. Never paid the back taxes on the southern easement either." He handed me the folder. Inside were 2 clean title records, both still in his name, both legally active. One covered a small crescent of land that jutted into the lake. The other covered the access road. He looked at me with a quiet kind of calculation. "You looking to buy?" he asked. "I am looking to protect," I said. He nodded once. "I respect that more." We negotiated over the course of 2 weeks. There was no middleman, no attorneys. Just 2 men who understood the value of things other people had forgotten. Water, silence, and the difference between ownership and assumption. He asked for a fair price. I paid in full. No financing, no delay. And just like that, I owned what they had claimed. The shoreline, the southern road, the sliver of lakebed that bled into the neighborhood's illusion of control. I had the deed notarized and stamped with the county seal. Then I mailed a single envelope to the HOA board. Inside was a certified copy of the recorded transfer and 1 handwritten note. "I wasn't fishing in your lake. I was fishing in mine." The fallout did not happen all at once. Pamela tried to pretend nothing had changed. For the first few days, she carried on as usual, patrolling the neighborhood in her pastel windbreaker, clipboard in hand. She sent out another newsletter about compliance expectations, and pending clarification on communal water zones. But her eyes started to dart more. Her smiles tightened at the edges. She no longer waved when she walked by my house. Then the questions started. Neighbors began emailing the board, asking about the deed, about the sign, about whether the lake was still covered by HOA insurance, or if their fees were going towards something they did not even have legal access to anymore. I heard about the emergency meeting before the flyer even hit my mailbox. This time, I did not attend. I stayed home, lights off, sitting on the dock with a thermos of coffee and the deed in my lap. It was quiet, not just outside, but inside me. Across the water, I could see figures gathering at the community hall windows, chairs scraping, spotlight flickering to life. I imagined the room, the brittle certainty Pamela had carried for so long, finally cracking under the weight of her own negligence. The moment someone stood up and said, "Wait, he owns it?" Because ownership is not a volume contest. It is not earned through noise or frequency. It is earned through paper, precision, and patience. And for the first time in months, I did not feel like I was defending something. I felt like I had reclaimed it. The next morning, a folded note appeared on my porch. It was unsigned. Would you consider allowing limited access to the dock for neighbors, not HOA? I smiled, tucked the note into my pocket, and walked down to the edge of the lake. The sign still stood, proud and weathered. I added one more beside it. Private lake, access by invitation only. Not to gloat, but to remind them, and myself, that I had not taken something from them. I had simply taken it back. Have you ever used the law to take back what was yours? Panic does not look how you expect. It is not wild-eyed screaming or fists slamming on desks. Not at first. It starts with denial. A smile held just a second too long, an email sent at midnight. A meeting no one really wants to attend. Pamela Crane was unraveling. Not with noise, but with desperation dressed as formality. The day after the deed arrived in her mailbox, she filed a complaint with the HOA legal committee. She called an emergency board session. She even attempted to send a cease and desist letter addressed to the private owner of formerly public water. They did not use my name. They could not bring themselves to say it. I watched it all happen quietly from the dock, sipping coffee while the world around her slipped out of her hands like water through a cracked cup. By the end of the week, her emails grew more erratic. She referenced community betrayal, claimed that the lake's symbolic value exceeded its legal designation. She demanded the board pursue legal action to reverse what she called an unauthorized private seizure of shared resources. But the HOA's attorney, a man named Stephen Marks, who lived 2 towns over and billed by the hour, refused. His response was short. Without documented ownership transfer from the developer, the HOA holds no enforceable claim over the lake or the access road. Pursuing legal action would be both ungrounded and potentially harmful to the association's reputation. In other words, she was on her own. That was when she made the worst mistake of all. She stepped onto my dock. It was early morning, fog still thick over the lake. I was in the shed behind the house, oiling a set of tools Claire had once used for her planter boxes, when I heard the click of heels on wood. Wrong shoes for that time of day, and definitely wrong shoes for that terrain. I walked around the side just in time to see Pamela standing near the water's edge, arms crossed, staring out, at the reflection of herself in the lake. She did not see me at first. I said nothing. She took one deep breath, as if rehearsing a speech, and then finally noticed the second sign I had posted at the dock's base. Private lake, no. HOA, access violators, prosecuted. Her face changed. A flicker of disbelief twisted into something colder. She took a step forward and ripped the sign clean off the post. That was the moment she knew she had lost. Not because I reacted. I did not. I just watched. But because even she could not believe how far she had gone. I reported the trespass the same morning, not to make a scene, not to retaliate, but because when someone crosses a line, a real, legal, notarized boundary, the record must reflect it. Deputy Ray came by that afternoon. He was quieter than usual, hat in hand, his voice lower. "She actually tore the sign down?" he asked. I handed him the footage from my security camera. He watched it on the small tablet I kept by the door. His mouth tightened. "I will file it formally," he said, "and notify the county. This is getting out of hand." I nodded. 2 days later, the court issued a protective order. Pamela Crane was officially barred from coming within 100 feet of the lake. The ruling cited multiple counts: trespassing on privately owned land, destruction of posted property notices, and refusal to comply with documented ownership boundaries. The order was clear. She could view the lake from her house, but she could not approach it, not from the road, not from the park, not from anywhere HOA jurisdiction once touched. The silence after that ruling was louder than anything she had shouted in the meetings. But the final moment, the one I will never forget, came a week later when Deputy Ray showed up at her front door with the paperwork in hand. I watched from my porch, not hiding. Pamela opened the door like she already knew. Her hair was pinned back too tight, her cardigan buttoned to the top, as if it could hold her together. Ray said something I could not hear. Then he handed her the envelope. She took it. Her fingers shook. She looked past him, across the street, right at me. And for the first time in months, maybe ever. She said nothing. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Just a small exhale, a kind of surrender. She stepped back inside and closed the door without a word. Ray walked over a minute later. "She did not argue," he said. "She had nothing left to argue," I replied. He gave a slow nod. "You ever think it would go this far?" I looked out at the lake, calm, undisturbed. "I never wanted it to," I said, "but I knew what I would do if it did." That evening, I replaced the sign she had torn down with something heavier, bolted it to the dock post, weatherproofed, permanent. "Private lake, court protected, trespassers prosecuted." I added 2 more signs along the road, one near the path from the HOA playground, the other near the bike trail where she used to patrol like a general watching over her troops. Each one stood like a quiet monument, not to victory, but to a boundary that would not be crossed again. They say the last strike ends the battle, but it does more than that. It tells everyone watching, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who doubted, the ones who were too afraid to speak, that the still ones are not weak. They are simply waiting for the moment when their silence speaks louder than anything else. And in the end, it did. The lake is quiet again. Not silent in the way grief is, not empty, but quiet in the way peace feels when it finally returns. Unannounced, unforced, and deeply earned. Each morning, I walk the shoreline with coffee in hand. Same mug, same route. The difference now is not in the path, but in how I carry it. The signs are still posted, firm and untouched. Neighbors do not whisper anymore when they pass. Some wave, a few stop and linger. There is a kind of reverence now in how they approach the dock, like they are stepping into a story they did not know how to read before. Last week, Jim Harper stopped by with his son, fishing rod in hand. No questions asked, just a glance toward me, more like a request than a demand. I nodded once. He nodded back. That was all. They sat near the edge of the dock for over an hour, caught nothing, said even less. But when they left, the boy smiled in that quiet way only lakes can create. That is all I ever wanted. Not to win, not to be right. Just to be left alone enough to feel stillness without having to defend it. Pamela resigned 2 weeks after the court order. There was no formal announcement, no speech. Just a short email from the HOA account, with her name replaced at the bottom by someone else's. Melody Harper told me there had been a vote. Quiet, private, and nearly unanimous. No drama, just drift. They say people like her never really leave, that they circle back, try to reclaim control in new forms. But I do not think Pamela will return. Not to the board, not to the dock, and certainly not to the water. She has seen what it does when you try to force something that was never yours to begin with. Claire would have liked this version of the lake. She always believed that still water ran deeper, not because it looked calm, but because it held so much underneath. The kind of depth you do not measure in feet, but in memory. This morning, I brought my rod out for the first time in a long while. The dock creaked beneath me as I sat. Same spot, same worn wood. I held the handle for a moment before casting, letting the line arc out into the water like a breath I had held too long. No applause, no protest. Just the lake, waiting. And for the first time since that first citation, I felt like I belonged there again. Not because I won, not because the deed had my name, but because the water no longer asked for permission. It simply reflected who remained,